is a dialogue on carbon pricing, which really, goes to the heart of some of the things that we were just hearing about. And we are delighted, absolutely delighted, to have with us as a moderator, Princella Talley, currently a journalist, previously somebody who worked on a full-time basis in the area of carbon pricing, the issues around carbon pricing. So I am going to turn this over to Princella Talley. We have three great panelists, and she's one of them, and she's going to moderate the session. So thanks, Princella.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mona. It's so nice to be here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session for a dialogue on carbon pricing. In the room with us today, we have speakers Dr. Sam Grant, who is a climate and environmental justice educator, facilitator, and organizer, working on numerous strategies to address climate change through the intersections of climate justice, racial justice, and culture. He is the executive director of Rainbow Research, a national science justice research and evaluation firm. We also have Dr. Dallas Burtraw, who is a senior fellow at Resources for the Future, a resource institution specializing in environmental and natural resource economics. He has worked on estimating the impact of air pollution on human health and the environment, and more recently on the design of climate policies, including carbon markets in California, the Northeast US, and the EU. And I am Princella Talley. I'll be one of your speakers and a moderator for this session. I'm a climate activist, a writer, and a Public Voices Fellow of the Op-Ed Project and the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. I've also worked as a development coordinator and the diversity outreach coordinator as part of the Citizens Climate Education team. And so with that, I'll jump right into this discussion by saying initially, I was very opposed to the idea of a carbon price because it felt to me like it would be a way to give polluters more room to pollute, even more so while claiming that they were holding themselves accountable financially, but finding workarounds to not pay for what they owe, especially to communities that have been most harmed by pollutants. But I started to become more open to the idea as I took time to learn about it, and I'm continuing to learn. So the first game changer for me was understanding some of those differences between cap and trade and carbon pricing. So oftentimes cap and trade is mentioned alongside a carbon price because both can prompt that transition to lower carbon technologies. Because carbon pricing is more of a general term, I really want to be clear here that I'm speaking specifically to the carbon fee and dividend model of carbon pricing. So while cap and trade and a carbon fee and dividend approach are sometimes viewed as one and the same, there are significant differences between the two in regards to pricing pollution and lowering carbon emissions. So for example, cap and trade creates a system for the buying and selling of allowances, which creates the potential for some smaller local facilities to continue to pollute while still claiming to lower emissions. So those co-pollutants, as you know, collectively have a tremendous impact on human health and the environment. In addition, those fluctuating price points can distract from the most important goal of lowering carbon emissions. And understandably so, those price fluctuations enabled by cap and trade creates uncertainty to business owners operating at all scales. And furthermore, cap and trade has more potential to leave the most impacted communities behind and creates room for those loopholes that can let polluters buy their way out of being held accountable for their impacts on air, water, and soil health, which is ultimately human health. So on the other hand, a carbon fee and dividend applied at the source, going as far upstream as possible, impacts all polluters regardless of the size of the company. And it doesn't make room for allowances, so therefore it's more predictable. And the carbon fee and dividend also makes it more difficult for companies to claim that they're paying their dues for their emissions while having room to manipulate the market in their favor at the same time. So a carbon fee and dividend approach also would not historically prefer secondary market trading, and it's usually not discussed in that way. And speaking of that market-based approach, I'll just speak briefly to the research from economics experts Ming and Hernandez-Cortez when they presented their research on environmental injustice. They focused on market-based environmental policies from a lens of race and socioeconomic status. And they were seeking to analyze the social impacts of cap and trade and carbon pricing. And they found, as I'll directly quote from their research, significant reductions in co-pollutant emissions in EJ communities when you're accounting for the facilities that do and do not have to pay the carbon price. And so with that, I'd like to pass the mic to Sam.
Thank you, Princella, for that excellent overview in your own journey from being opposed to carbon pricing to recognizing it as something that is critical as we think about moving our world ecology towards sanity. So as I think about the question of sanity, my great frustration is that we are not yet having an open, democratic, intercultural, ecological conversation that braids and bridges all of the perspectives and gives equal valence to the voices that oppose market fundamentalism. So given the work that I do all over the planet with people in peasant movements, in indigenous movements, and in urban slum movements, and in poor BIPOC communities, I feel personally obligated to speak in opposition to carbon pricing, but to also speak as a relative to my beloved extended family that sees it as part of the solution. And what I'm interested in is how do we move from painful and violent intractability in this conversation toward what Martin Luther King Jr. talked about as beloved community. So the first point I want to make is to encourage everybody to go online and look up the work of the Indigenous Environmental Network and the Climate Justice Alliance. Together, they have published a set of perspectives sort of walking us through the deleterious impacts of the climate crisis on the communities most impacted who've contributed the least to the crisis, and the particular ways in which they have a resounding critique of carbon pricing as a viable strategy. They call it a false solution. So point number one, the critique of carbon pricing from Indigenous Environmental Network and the Climate Justice Alliance is that it reinforces and socially reproduces the existing patterns in the world that impede the realization of climate justice by protecting the power and privilege of global elites at the expense of the world's most poor and oppressed. The second point is that I understand the world we're living in. We live in a world that is market fundamentalist. And in that world, I appreciate the mindful critique that radical political economist Robin Hanel put out to the whole climate justice movement. And he said, I understand why you're fighting against carbon pricing, but if you recognize, as I do, that we are in a capitalist world ecology, we have to be aware and focused on this critical question. How do we get people who are intransigent on even being in the conversation to enter a conversation which gives them a starting place, meeting them where they're at? And so the way to meet market fundamentalists where they're at is to meet them in the market. So accepting Robin Hanel's critique that we need to braid a new center that brings our perspectives into discourse, I feel like we have to address the gap between rhetoric and action. Since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988 by two African men, leading the World Meteorological Organization and leading the United Nations Environment Program, the voices of African people and indigenous people has been ignored. We get spaces in the room after lots of strenuous struggle, but by 2009, given 21 years of failing to adequately address our concerns, people began to complexify their social movement strategies and take the argument both into the climate negotiations, but also out into the street, and now also adding a whole lot of critical environmental justice education in communities. And to get to a point that Mark Mitchell made in the last session, address the starvation of environmental justice communities by saying it's necessary in the 21st century to radically increase investments in environmental justice. And in fact, anyone who cares about environmental integrity needs to put your money where your mouth is and invest in environmental justice. There is no environmental integrity without environmental justice. There is no environmental integrity without environmental justice. In the conversation around science and scientific practice, there's a disconnect between the way that people trained in conventional science fail to recognize indigenous ecological knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge as critically valuable in the 21st century. So I'm calling for an open science paradigm that's democratically constructed to bring all of our perspectives together and focus attention on how do we lead the 21st century from the perspective, the vision, the hopes, and the dreams, and the gifts of the people from the most marginalized communities on the planet. And the third point I want to make is that the failure to upgrade scientific practice to focus energy on open science continues to facilitate these patterns of ecological imperialism on the planet, which is accumulation by dispossession. And I'm going to wrap up in a second, Princella. So bear with me. I promised I was going to be concise, and I'm already blowing my integrity here, so I apologize. But a couple of points I want to make just to sort of come to a close. There's an indigenous lawyer and activist who's been involved in the Paris agreements who said, his name is Alberto Salamando, and you can find his quote in Hoodwinked in the Hot House. So the Paris Agreement is a trade agreement, nothing more. It promises to privatize, commodify, and sell forested lands as carbon offsets in fraudulent schemes, such as REDD+ projects. These offset schemes provide a financial laundering mechanism for developed countries to launder their carbon pollution on the backs of the global South. Case in point, the United States Climate Change Plan includes 250 million megatons to be absorbed by oceans and forest offset markets. Essentially, those responsible for the climate crisis not only get to buy their way out of compliance, but also get to profit from it as well. And there's a lot more I could say, but I will just bring it into the dialogue that Princella and Dallas and I will have. So Dallas, I yield to you, my dear friend.
Thank you so much, Sam. That's very profound. Those are very profound thoughts. And so the point about market fundamentalism, the point about the commodification of the environment, and it's not just about firms, it's also about us as individual souls. Or are we absolved of responsibility once we've paid a price? If we were buying a pollution permit, oh, then now we're done. We can just go ahead, just buy the permits that we need and for the gasoline that we use and the heating of our homes, and we have no further responsibility. These are profound moral questions. I almost hesitate to go into my prepared remarks because they're so profound that we need to dwell on them. But I'm going to put some information out there also, and then we're going to come back for a dialogue. So thank you, Sam and Princella. I'm a practicing environmental economist and been involved in organizing a lot of carbon markets and carbon pricing in other forms. And so some high level ideas I want us all to have in front of us. It is often argued that carbon pricing, like taxes or markets or the approaches Princella mentioned, award an indulgence that enables polluters to buy their way out of emissions reductions at least past a certain point. And this is true. That's exactly what it does. But it's important, though, to recognize the historic context. For over a century, the authority to license polluting activity has resided with states in the US, under the US Constitution, and they issued licenses to pollute for free. So emissions pricing, at least, let's recognize it, changes the dynamic by making firms pay for the right to pollute that previously, and still in most cases, for most pollutants that they receive for free. So in thinking about carbon pricing, and how it can be useful to us, there's three crucial ideas. What is the right price? Who gets the revenue? And how does carbon pricing interact with other regulations and affect vulnerable groups? So in terms of what is the right price? Economists, sorry for some of the jargon, but you'll recognize some of it. In the context of greenhouse gases, we talk about the social cost of carbon. And the right price would be to set the pollution cost at that level. This theory has little or nothing to say about distributional impacts or about procedural justice. It's just the recommendation that comes out of economics. But let me go on to say that a carbon price set at the social cost of carbon would be very powerful. As of this day, the federal government's price is estimated to be about $50 a ton. But in the next few months under this administration, with a rigorous review of the science, I'm going to predict that price has tripled to well over $100. In most places today, the price is zero. Most pollution happens without the polluters paying anything at all. In California, the price is currently $28 a ton. In the EU, before the Ukrainian crisis, the price was up to $100 per ton. And but that applies only to the power and industrial sector. And in the industrial sector, they get their emission allowances for free. So I'm going to assert that my view is that a high carbon price applied broadly would go very far to reduce emissions rapidly. But unfortunately, a carbon price set at the level to fulfill this fiction I just laid out there, because it's a fiction at this point, it would be very problematic. Politically, a high price like this would affect consumers and exacerbate energy poverty. And economically, probably even more realpolitik in the world in which we live in, is that a price like that triggers leakage, that is the movement of economic activity outside the regulated jurisdiction, and unfairly benefits firms and jurisdictions that don't put any price on carbon. So you have a prisoner's dilemma kind of situation. It's very important to coordinate if there's going to be carbon pricing. That's going to be very difficult to get carbon pricing up at a level where carbon pricing can do a lot of the work. The second thing is that if carbon pricing is applied more aggressively, it's important to recognize that it creates a huge value. In North America, this would be the largest creation of a federally enforced property right, or they say intangible property right in this case, since the 19th century. And so a crucial question, and this should be, I really want to encourage my sisters and brothers in the environmental justice movement to really keep this at the front of your minds. To whom does this value accrue? And that's the crucial question. And finally, one may hear economists say that with a carbon price in place, then any other policy will be inefficient and only raise costs, and we don't need to do anything. As a matter of fact, we should get rid of other regulations and put a carbon price in place. This view is wholly dismissive of institutional, distributional, and political economy issues, including ones I've already mentioned. And in fact, detractors of carbon pricing will, from observed experience, say, well, carbon pricing has not been able to get the job done, and therefore, want to conclude that it's failed, when failure has fundamentally been political, not economic, and by setting prices that are too low for carbon pricing to be effective. And worse, carbon pricing, even at a low level, is often offered as a ruse to eviscerate other regulations. It's like this, like we're going to do a little horse trade, and we're going to take out all the protections of the Clean Air Act and let you put in a small carbon price. So these are the kind of things you have to guard about, when in fact, it's regulations by far that have done the most to achieve emission reductions to date. And that's true even where we see carbon pricing in place. So over the last few years, there's been a great awakening, I would say, a rejection of this, at least among economists and policy advocates in many jurisdictions around North America and Europe, where I do my work. There's a rejection of the either or proposition in setting prices or versus regulations. I mean, really, from the standpoint of polluting industry, this is a perfect setup to get us fighting among ourselves, right? It's like, no, this is the right approach. No, that's the right approach. Your approach is stupid. Carbon pricing can be effective, and we should get as much of it as we can get. That's my view. But regulations for vehicles, buildings, power plants, industry, mandate efficiency, protect vulnerable communities, control local air pollution, drive investment. These are also entirely crucial. And but however, just relying on regulations is piecemeal and slow. And carbon pricing complements these regulations by making sure that we leave no low-cost emission reduction behind. Even with a modest carbon price, that's the best thing that it can achieve for us. So in summary, 4 ideas. Carbon pricing sells an industrial license to pollute, but this beats the alternative, which is giving away that license for free. Second, a carbon price at least at the social cost of carbon, which is much higher than anything we've seen today, would do quite a bit of work, but we face practical, political, and powerful barriers to sufficiently high carbon price. Third, carbon pricing creates enormous economic value, even at modest levels. And increasingly so at high levels, at necessary levels. So the number one thing I feel from an economic justice perspective is to keep our eyes on who gets that value. And we can come back and talk about that. And I know Princella has ideas about this. And fourth, the climate policy debate is moving beyond this joust that of either or proposition that puts us in a circular firing squad. Pricing and regulations both need to be more stringent, and they are complementary. They can be designed to be complementary and not undermine each other. And they can together inspire innovation and investments and protect communities. So I'll turn it back to you, Princella, and I hope I didn't go too long.
You're fine. Thank you, Dallas. Would you be willing to speak to a border carbon adjustment?
Oh, okay. Sure, I would. Border carbon adjustment is the idea I mentioned in passing there, that if a jurisdiction were to successfully put carbon pricing in one form or another in place that was at a sufficiently high level, the polluters are really paying, really feeling the pain for their emission reductions and had to take steps to reduce. Well, they would be incurring two kinds of costs. They'd be paying the price for the pollution, the residual pollution, and they'd be making a lot of investments to reduce that pollution. And at least in the short and the long run, I firmly believe this, and this is a platform for economic growth and development. More efficient economies are what we need and want. There's public health benefits, but in the short run, it throws a lot of businesses at an economic disadvantage if they're acting alone or getting too far out in front. So a border carbon adjustment would be an adjustment to tax, or in some ways put a price on the carbon that's embedded in fuels or in products that are imported into that jurisdiction, and offer some kind of relief, perhaps. This is much debate about whether exported products from that jurisdiction should get some kind of subsidy, or at least a production incentive, so that so we see a border carbon adjustments actually in the much maligned California, I think probably among some folks in this call, much maligned California program, but it does offer two examples of border carbon adjustments that are the only real ones in the world. And so in that sense, it's really an important, testing ground. And that has to do in the power sector, where there's a cost imposed on imported power that has emissions, as well as power that's generated in the state. And then sort of analogously, that's the main one. And then analogously for industrial activity, there is a production incentive that's granted to them to try to keep that production inside the state. If you don't have measures like this, then somewhere between, well, it depends by industry, but somewhere between $25 and $50 per ton, it's suggested that you really start to lose economic activity, and there's nobody benefits if by putting a price on carbon, you just see emissions leave the state and economic activity leave the state.
Thank you. And to your point, Dallas, I do have thoughts when it comes to it being problematic, carbon pricing, and who would get that revenue. So for me, carbon pricing models that are using that carbon fee and dividend approach, making those direct payments available to everyone without a middleman, who can possibly redirect or misappropriate the funds that should just be going back to members of the community who were most impacted, while also lowering the health risk in those communities and the other implications that have happened through environmental injustice. I think that the immediate needs of environmental justice communities should be addressed, along with infrastructure and building community resilience. And I mean, to be sure, the economy-wide impact of carbon pricing through a carbon fee and dividend model is going to initially raise those prices for everyone, but it won't stay that way. So people with that smaller carbon footprint, who are most often from lower income households, they'll do the best over time, because that monthly dividend from the carbon fee would kick in during the first year. And that dividend itself could offset that cost increase, which is especially important as prices go up with the carbon fee, because undue financial burden, it shouldn't be handed off to people who contribute the very least to pollution. Those most responsible for the degradation of our planet should undoubtedly be the ones held financially responsible, and they should be held most accountable by the fee. So an issue that I find is, while the carbon fee does give an equal payment or dividend back to every household, and the amount each person gets will go up every year as the fee goes up, when I say give that equal dividend back, that's equality, but that's not equity. So whereas equality is treating us all the same, that equity acknowledges that everyone wasn't put at the same starting point in the race. And that's usually due to societal injustices and unjust policies and circumstances beyond their control. And more specific to environmental justice, we can look to the NIMBY and the PIBY effects that, in summary, support those privileged communities and place harmful facilities full of the most pollutants in the under-resourced communities that tend to lack the social capital to keep unwanted developments out of their neighborhoods. And when the privileged community says the NIMBY, not in my backyard, the response is often the PIBY, place it in Blacks' backyards, especially those who are economically disadvantaged. And, I credit my understanding of that terminology to environmental justice leader, Dr. Robert Bullard. And for those reasons, carbon pricing with the carbon fee and dividend approach, it can't be the entire answer, but I believe it is a very important piece of the puzzle as its effects go upstream and tax all polluters. And a carbon fee and dividend policy can be complementary to other policies aiming to slash those emissions. So yes, I do support a carbon fee and dividend to price carbon, but that doesn't mean it has to be the only solution, nor should it be. It is an ideal starting point that can promote fairness and limit corruption with everyone getting the same, but more focused targeting should continue to be up for discussion and assessed. But the concept to me is a great starting place. And Sam, I'm thinking you might have some thoughts on that.
I have some thoughts on it, but I first want to say thank you to Princella and Dallas for your really rounded perspectives. I mean, you guys have thought a whole lot about this, and you're coming at this from a place with significant complex nuance and appreciation for our common interest in trying to find where are the braiding points. So I want to speak from the vantage point of structural violence. And I think that this is a medical consortium, conference. You all are the people who are the world's experts and among the most passionate advocates for a public health model that truly sets conditions so that no matter where you live, no matter what body you're born into, we have a public health system at all scales that will meet you where you are and bring you on the journey towards great health, so that with that great health, you can have great thriving. We're a long, long way from that arc of justice that Martin Luther King Jr. said our world system would eventually bend towards. I have questions about how do we wisely hit the accelerator so that we stop perpetrating so much structural violence. If you live in North Minneapolis, the zip codes 55411 and 55412 as examples, and you're in a Black body, you live 11 years less than the average. What mechanisms are available for your voice to be heard if you live in one of those environmental justice communities? The legal mechanisms we have available to environmental justice communities in the United States, to say that they're woefully inadequate isn't an acceptable assessment of the severity of the problem. We have created a world perspective that privileges the right to profit over the right to life. And you can see that written into and inscribed in public policy since the birth of neoliberalism, which I characterized as having begun with the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. So that's when neoliberalism really began, not in 1973, as some people say, with the overthrow of the Allende regime in Chile. So what have we done since 1968? What we have said is we're going to sort of take the gloves off of this world capitalist ecology and let it use structural violence to facilitate increasing accumulation by dispossession across the world. So even as we look for the fight in renewable energy, we think about the just transition, even in the just transition space. When I talk to my friends in the renewable energy sector about mineral extractivism in Africa, that is key to the development of the renewable age, people blow it off. And they just say, we can't afford to worry about that right now. And so I go back again to Martin Luther King Jr. and his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, where he critiqued the liberal mindset that always says we care about your well-being and will eventually create conditions where that's also a possibility. But right now we have other priorities. So what I'm looking for is that kind of an open democratic conversation, which I see glimmers of in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And I saw glimmers of in the great work led by Kofi Annan with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where we recognize by scientists all over the planet that of the 24 core ecosystem services, 15 were in significantly degraded status. My own assessment of that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment is that we use consensus-based science that reinforce the privileges of our world's most powerful nations and corporations. And a sober analysis from the Global South actually indicates that we are in significantly degraded status on all 24 of those core ecosystem services. So what I'm looking for is an open science platform where we really think about this together. And until we can begin to think together in a democratic, equitable way, we're not going to generate the solutions that I really feel like we need. And time is getting short. The last report from the IPCC says that we've already baked in 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's done. It's happening. 1.5 is happening. And all of the global movements of the South are saying we have to not go above 1.5. It's already baked in. And we're on the way to 2 because we're still using this market logic that's allowing the continued exploitation of fossil fuels, not just natural gas, which is really cheap and readily available right now, but we're still going after, oil and still going after, coal in places around the planet. And, with the Ukraine and Russia, situation right now, we're seeing some countries in the European Union face an energy crisis. And so they're pedaling backwards on their just transition and going back to fossil fuels again. So I have really significant concerns. And so what's my sense of antidote? I'll just say a couple of things in terms of things I'm trying to do that practice this open science paradigm. Friends of mine with the Nature Conservancy had an objective to reforest 1 million acres in Minnesota as a carbon sequestration strategy. And they're friends of mine. So I said, well, how about if you do that in a way that actually facilitates climate justice? And they said, we haven't really thought about what that might look like. And you show us how we might do that. So we, wrote a grant together. And now we're creating a just reforestation council composed of Native nations in Minnesota, but also some of the emerging BIPOC communities across the state. And we're saying, let's think about a circular economy, growing seeds together, growing ecological knowledge together in a way that seeds a different future than would obviously arrive if we stayed with the default trajectory of existing patterns of anti-Black violence and colonialism against Indigenous nations in Minnesota. So I have no idea how well that's going to work, but at least the opportunity to facilitate active braiding feels like it's moving in the right direction. A second initiative is looking at the fact that in Minnesota, which has 110,000 plus white farmers, but only 1,400 farmers that are not white, we're working on a strategy to try and increase land access and tenure for BIPOC farmers, but instead of getting one farmer onto the land at a time, we're going back to cooperative economics and agricultural extension, and we're inviting farmers to get onto the land in clusters, cooperatively owning the land and sharing ecological knowledge as they figure out how to do 4 things at the same time: sequester as much carbon as they can in their practices, bring back as much biodiversity as they can in their practices, cooperate with each other to actively learn and grow their capacities collectively, and then do what they can to hospice the negative impacts of industrial agriculture across the planet and invite more people to benefit from, contribute to, and consume within local living economy. So those are just 2 of many examples. And one more thing I'll say before I shut up is around the world, I am very excited about the opportune intersectionality of our last remaining stores of biodiversity and the association of those places with the last remaining stores of indigenous languages. If we make a commitment on the planet that we're going to stop all schemes that do carbon offsets on the backs of biodiversity and the backs of indigenous people, and we're going to call those global protection zones instead of sacrifice zones, which my indigenous friends say they feel like they are across the planet. That's one message that we could be sending by shaping robust policy there that would make me feel like we're finally moving in the direction that we need to move. So I'll yield now.
Princella, can I respond to Sam on that. That was, again,
Absolutely.
just brilliant, Sam. Thank you. And one point you made was about the violence of, in my words now, but I heard you say the violence of resource extraction. I mean, we use resources all the time, but it's the way in which we do it to the environment, the way in which we do it to affected communities, that's where the violence lies. And so it is just a small shift to understand that pollution is in the same vein, because it has to do with the extraction of the assimilative ability of the atmosphere to absorb pollution. And so I don't know where this leads, except that you can't separate the struggles for one from the other, really. You can't wish away the practice of resource extraction and what it does to the land and what it does to the people. And you can't wish away the air pollution problem either. In this, for the purposes of this 45-minute conversation, we're talking about carbon pricing. You know, resources are, those who extract resources no way pay near the price of those resources when they come out of the ground and what it does to the earth that it leaves behind. But I just want to, I wish we could have I wish I could get everyone to join my chorus to say the solution is not to say, therefore, let's just, we can't wish away that there's going to be resource extraction. There's going to be, and we can't say we're going to like stop holding auctions for timber and oil because they're going to continue to harvest timber and oil and then not pay for it. And that's why similarly, I think we need to make polluters pay. But then, as all the people I work with or went to school with or teach with, many of them will think that's the end of the problem. And no, that's coming in, you know, in the fifth part of the problem, and it's only a small part of the whole agenda that has to happen. So I think carbon pricing is imperative, but it is far from sufficient for what we need to be doing, and it's not even at the front of the list. I agree with you. I think we would agree with each other on those points. I hope we would.
Thank you.
Dallas. Princella?
Yes, I'd like to pose this question to both of you. Is it conceivable that we can move beyond voluntary targets towards mandated targets? And can carbon pricing be used as a carrot and stick to get more fossil fuel burning nations to rapidly reduce burning greenhouse gases and invest in renewables?
It's an important question. And Dallas, I'll let you go first.
Right. Well, the carrot and stick part, that is essentially what we like to think carbon pricing can do. And Princella, you talked about the fiend dividend approach. There's a carrot there for those who are, you know, seeing a change in their energy prices because of a carbon price that's wrapped in that, but they're getting this dividend back that for a majority of households in the country, if you said equity is not justice, I forget your exact phrase, but even if it was equal per capita, estimates are 50 to 70% of households in the country would be net winners under that approach. And in those that net winner group is by far the low-income households because they use fewer resources. So for everybody, it's something equal back. It's sort of like a social security model, in that we're all in this together. That's politically very compelling. But it may be that you need to do other things with some of that revenue. This is where the trade-off, you know, there's other crushing needs for revenue for innovation and infrastructure, whether it be efficiency in homes or electric vehicle charging stations or whatever. Those are some of the carrots that come out of the carbon pricing framework because so much revenue is generated. And so the critical question that we need to, in this one little part, in this one kitchen table, what we really need to be, I think we mean everybody in this room right now, have to be at the table is how that revenue is used. That's the thing to keep your eyes on, even if you want to say it's a small or big part of the overall portfolio. But the stick part is that as that price grows over time, it creates, it punishes the legacy incumbent polluters and benefits emerging industries and emerging firms that are finding new ways to do things that has less of an impact on the environment.
Thank you, Dallas. That was a lot to say and breathe in. And we were getting close on time already. This has gone by really, really fast. It's whirlwind 45 minutes. So I look forward to us being able to hang out for like a 3-hour dialogue and go really a lot deeper into this. But what can I say in really short order here? What am I hopeful about in terms of the braiding point? if we thought together about an appropriate social cost of carbon, and Dallas, in your comments earlier, you talked about that price is going up to above $100 in some markets. And I made an argument to some of my friends in Indigenous and Black organizing communities that I wanted to see us fight for putting the price at $200. And my friends said, something similar to what I think Dallas and Princella have both said here. Well, that would have some short-term deleterious effects because those prices are passed on to environmental justice communities. But Princella made the very clear point, which I appreciate, eventually over time, as the market gets corrected, those prices would come back down and benefit more and more consumers. But here's something I have to say out loud. Given the intersections of the economic, political, ecological, and cultural crisis on the planet, we're seeing inflation pressures on the world's most poor. Prices for food is going up, prices for gas is going up, prices for healthcare is going up, prices for housing is going up, prices for education is also going up. And so as those intersecting realities continue to happen, we need mechanisms beyond price to heal our relations with each other. And so the question that I always want to bring discourse into balance: how do you not privilege the market, objectives, but bring market objectives into balance with moral objectives, ecological objectives, ethical objectives, cultural objectives? And so the struggle that I feel like I'm obligated for my ancestors and family to continue to stand for is to be in that conversation and to nourish conditions for an intercultural, ecological, deep democracy where we matter all of our lives, all of the ecosystems on which our lives depend. And we don't do that by commodifying our relations with each other. We see a different value in honoring mutuality. The flourishing of humans and the flourishing of all life is the objective to win in the 21st century. All of you as health professionals, I would assume I don't have to fight too hard with you to say, yes, we agree with that. Let's go. Let's make it happen.
Would you like to speak to that, Dallas, in the time we have left?
Boy, no, I'm totally on board with with what Sam just said.
Same here.
I'll just say that there are. I work with economists primarily, not exclusively, but there's been a real change of thinking over the last 20 years that's coming, maybe not very far as you like, and not as fast as you like, but definitely headed in the direction that you're addressing us, Sam. And most of the folks I know who work in this subject area really want to help, and I think they've pulled their heads inside they've shed some of their hubris, and recognizing like this isn't a missionary, we're kind of we're here to serve, but nonetheless, there's a lot of talent and a lot of skill among environmental economists. There's 1,000 of them in the association I work with, and the EJ movement could take advantage of them and put them to work. Tell them, give them what for, and tell them the way things should go, and they want to be involved in that conversation.
Thank you. And I know we don't have much time left, but it's something we all agreed on was that these dialogues have to continue. And you posed a really important question, Sam, about what it would take for people left outside of the climate negotiations to have more power to co-shape the agreements. Something I'm particularly, that's caused my spirit is the flower model that bases itself on community co-design, multi-solving in ways that can garner broad political support by focusing on health, wellness, energy, infrastructure, things like that. So if any of you would like to speak to that to close out, I know we're at the top of the hour, but that's all I'll say on that. And I do hope these conversations continue.
I just will quickly jump in and say that flower model was new to me, and it's a refreshing and brilliant way to learn and communicate. And so it was in the link, I believe, and so I encourage everyone to take a look at it.
Thank you. It was also my first time seeing the flower model. In some of the movements in agroecology, we have this perspective that we've taken from work by a permaculture designer whose name I don't remember right now, but he developed 8 forms of capital. So if we privilege in our economy financial capital, but there's 7 other forms of capital, spiritual capital, cultural capital, kinship capital, physical capital, human capital, and the list goes on. By balancing all of those, we learn how to do what my Anishinaabe relatives in northern Minnesota call Mino Bimawadazin, which is living the good life. And living the good life requires living in right relationship with nature and each other at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so I look forward to a human civilization that organizes human systems that honor all of life as the way to facilitate thriving. So we sort of diminish the sense that economic growth is the be all and end all of society. And we say human, spiritual, and ecological potential is the be all and end all. We want to bring those things into balance. So that's the future I look forward to and co-creating with all of you. Many blessings and continue.